All right, everyone, I think we can get started. I see many people have logged in. It's good to see everyone here this morning joining us for this talk. So we're very happy to host Mantoa Motinyane today, who is an associate professor at the University of the Western Cape, and she's a very well-known figure in South African linguistics, having had a lot of leadership positions, for example, in ALASA and newly also in SALN. She's just joined the executive committee. Mantoa holds a PhD and MA from the University of Florida and a BA from the University of Cape Town, where she was also a faculty member for some years before she moved to the University of the Western Cape. She's headed a major research project funded by the NIHSS on psycholinguistics of Southern African or South African languages specifically, and psycholinguistics is her main research area. But she has also published and produced some of her dissertations in different areas of linguistics, including morphosyntactic work, discourse analysis, and also on more sociolinguistic issues like multilingualism. Yeah, so you can find more about her publications on her various websites. But for now, I think we are ready to listen to her presentation. So I'm going to share the slides. And Mantoa, you can start when you're ready. I'm going to mute myself already.
Okay. Thanks very much, Christina and Hlumela and your team for the invitation. It's quite nice to listen to someone introducing you and making you feel so glorious. So thank you very much for a very nice introduction. My network is kind of a little iffy this morning. So I just switched on the camera so that you can see that I am here. And I'll switch it on again when we come to the discussions. So like she said, I'm Mantoa Motinyane from the University of the Western Cape. The one thing that she didn't mention is that I'm currently the director of the Center for Advanced Studies of African Society, which you see there. And we hope by being a part of this presentation, you'll also take time to check our website and see some of the projects that we engaged in. So I look forward to seeing you there. I'll try and indicate when to change without making it sound too obvious. So we can start with the introduction. The topic today is on the infinitive, and particularly whether the loss of it or the non-use of it in certain speech forms of adults is a sign of language change, or whether it's just a variation. So the angle that I'm taking today is insights from child language development studies, which is a part of psycholinguistics. And that's the area that I've been working on. So we are all aware that Bantu languages are known. Whenever you talk about Bantu languages, we know they have this very elaborate noun class system and agreement system. And because of that, research has focused mainly on noun classes and agreement. Is the sound still okay? Okay, so as part of learning about how children acquire language, we use what we call benchmarks, and the benchmarks are based on adult language, adult speech. So we look at what adults say, and I've said speech in inverted commas there, because in many instances, we look at the textbooks or descriptions, grammars to describe what the normal language should be, if I may call it normal. So just to give a little bit of background, The connection between language change and language acquisition has been used to account for some observed grammatical changes over centuries in many languages. For example, in the Balkan languages, Greek has also lost the infinitive in some forms. So it's not something new. So this connection is tied to the belief that children learn language from the environment where people speak, their caregivers, their mothers, siblings, and yet their system, which is the grammar, may be different from that of their parents' input, because children say things that adults would never say. So which means that there is some system that's operational in children that's independent of the environment as well. And this is because of the pressures of acquisition, where children want to express themselves. They use this system to try and navigate. So of course, children, when they are learning a language, they find this weak points in the grammar, and they try to fix them. So if I can pick some examples, in English now, we used to have was and were, and right now a lot of children and a lot of adults are now just using was everywhere. And so it's just a typical example of how, if we feel like a system is irregular, we find a way to fix it. So hence the understanding of language acquisition may shed some light on the language changes in general, because adults tend to do what children do when they learn language. So the changes in language, in child language, in some way may mirror the grammar of adult grammar over a period of time, as attested by Lightfoot in a number of his studies. But unfortunately for us in Bantu languages, especially in Southern Africa, we don't have those resources that date back that we can compare to say, this is how people spoke in 1800, and this is how they speak now, or 1700 for that matter. So the only information we have is based on the written resources, and we can also study children to try and understand this a little bit more. Okay, the next slide. So the connection between language, the next one. Thank you. So as I was saying, the descriptions, the previous one, sorry, yeah. The descriptions of language variation have laid some groundwork for studies of language acquisition. So we can now start to look at possible connections between acquisition and language change or variation. And what I hope to do with this paper is to look at some of the similarities between the acquisition of the infinitive by children and how the infinitive is used, the variation that we see in both spoken and formal language. So we hope to shed some light on the components of grammar and understanding of how acquisition may reflect possible changes in the grammatical structure. The outline. Christine, slide please for the outline.
Sorry, which one is it? Do I go forward, or I don't have an overview of the slides? Or do you want me to just wait? I can.
I think this question that we hope to address. No, this one is fine.
The question slide,
fine.
is it okay?
Yes, yeah. So these are the questions that we are looking at. And you will see this is a very long presentation, but I'll try and fit everything in. So I don't hope to have clear questions, but hopefully I'll get some insights from people. This is work that has been going on over a long period. So we are looking at the deletion of ku, which is generalized across the language. whether it's generalized across the language or whether it's limited to the infinitive only. We also want to understand the properties of ku, that which is the infinitival morpheme or the noun class marker, and why it is targeted. What is it about it that makes it a subject of a target of deletion? What aspect of child language acquisition can shed some light on this change? And the more difficult questions, the last two, is how do we know that this is change in adult speech and not some form of fossilized input that children were speaking like this as children and never really grew out of it? And do we consider this to be a change in progress, or is this just variation or some stylistic on the part of the adults? Next. Okay, so I'll outline quickly where the data for the various studies, because I'm not reporting on one, it's quite a few of them, where they came from, so just generally. And then we look at some properties of the infinitive in trying to understand why it may be targeted for deletion. Then we look at some acquisition of Bantu languages, very generally in a summary, and then compare the observed changes in adult language and the acquisition patterns in children. And then finally, we'll, as part of the concluding remarks, I'll try to illustrate why it's necessary for us to understand these patterns in the acquisition of language and how they may account for our understanding of the progress or the change that we see in adult speech. Next. So the data for the child language comes from mostly studies from Glelishe. I think the first one is 2007. I can send this afterwards. And then the others are Tsonope, Sneyman, Kunene. So these are summaries of people who have studied the progression of language in children from as early as 2 years old up to 6. Some of them are from students that I've supervised who did a MSc in speech pathology, looking at the phonological development of isiXhosa, Sesotho, Setswana, isiZulu, and Kiswahili from the University of Cape Town. Next. Oh, the one part, but don't change the slide. The one part that I forgot about the methods for data collection. One of the sources of the variation, in addition to Facebook and Twitter, come from third-year university formal assignments where there was this variation. In some instances, the ku is retained, in some it was deleted. And I have some examples of this. You'll see them later. So generally, the infinitive is regarded as it's similar to English, even though it's morphologically richer than the English one. In a sense, we call it a gerund because it can be a noun and it can also be a verb. So the number of proposals that have been given to account for the infinitive in Bantu really show that it's a very complex category. So, for example, it's called a category that switches. Like it switches from being a noun to a verb. It's also called, it has shared properties. The one that I like is by Mugane, and it hasn't been challenged. That is an extra sequential hybrid construction. It's also referred to as mixed morphology category. And I didn't want to name it anything. I just said it only becomes an infinitive in the instance where it's selected by control verbs. Next. So I'm going to walk you through very quickly the a thing that I'm going to be referring to. So if you look at the noun classes in isiXhosa, the very last one, number 15, it's not the last one, but the other ones are not that significant. So usually we just stop at 15. So the last one, the ukutya, it can be food or to eat, depending on the tone and also depending on the position of the noun in a sentence. And although we call them nouns, there are really, there aren't any nouns that are not derived, that are underived, that are not used as verbs in other instances. So if there are students who are really keen, you know, I think they can go out to try and find nouns that are underived in class 15. So those are the ones that we are going to be making reference to. And then if you look at number 10 and 11, those we are going to make reference to as well as number 5 and number 6. So those are the targets of the current study. Next. The process of noun derivation in Bantu languages is actually very popular. It's very productive, not popular. Although there are some restrictions, as you see with G and H there at the end, you don't find where you can just pick a noun class prefix and attach it to a verb and find that it's grammatical. There are yet some studies to be carried out to find out what is it about some of the noun classes, why they cannot take why they cannot take prefixes from certain noun classes. Now, what is interesting about this noun derivation process, what it reflects is that you don't, in child speech, you don't find children making mistakes like that. They can omit the noun class prefix if they are not familiar with it, but they don't switch the noun classes, the noun class prefixes. So this is something that's happening in language. Adults don't do this, children don't either. But they do make other mistakes, but not this kind of error. Next. Okay, then the infinitive in isiXhosa, it can be found in very, very different areas. For example, you can find it in the subject position, as you see in sentence B, the ukusebenza kunzima, it's working as a subject there. And you can also find it in an object position, abantwana bafuna ukusebenza, which is can be to work or can be they want work. Okay, next one. Hopefully you'll remember this, but if not, we'll come back to them. So the infinitive can also take verbal modifiers, which is a good indication that it does have more verbal properties than it has the nominal ones, even though I'll show that it does take nominal modifiers as well. So for example, you can see it takes the causative in sentence B, umama ufuna ukufundisa abantwana, and then it can, in 3, umama ufuna ukufundisa abantwana kakuhle. So you can see that it takes the causative. It takes many others as well, but I just gave an example there to show that. And pay attention to the pro there, because we'll come back to that in the discussion. Next. again, just like your normal verbs, the infinitive takes negation as well, which is something that raised a lot of discussions in the literature, together with tense as well, that it can take tense. And the reason for accepting that it takes tense is that the negation becomes different if this is used in the past tense. I think I didn't give you that example there. For example, if you say ufundisa, you can say ukungafundisi, as you can see in sentence 3 there. So the normal umama akafuni, so you can see this is the normal negation with a normal verb. So you have your negative, you have your subject marker, and then you have your verb and the final vowel, which is an I. And then when you have the, when you want to negate the infinitive, umama ufuna becomes umama ufuna ukungafundisi abantwana. She wants not to teach the children. So you can see the same properties that you find in sentence B there. You have the negation and then you have the final vowel. You find those as well. Now, there's no negation on the uku, which is different from the negation that you find with the subject marker in sentence B. Next. Okay, so what we've looked at is basically what we refer to as the infinitive proper, but we also find this morpheme ku appearing in other places as well. And when I was looking at the data from Facebook, Twitter, and some of the assignments from the students, there were indications that the ku is not just deleted when it's in the infinitive. You also find it in other things like conjunctions. Instead of people saying ukuba, they say uba. It used to be in the spoken language, but now it's in the written as well. So you find it with the possessive there, where we've made a word, a compound, a noun, to mean things to play with, is in dozokudlala. So there's the ukudlala there. And then the second one, that's a future tense, ozakukuka, they contract that, becomes uzokuka, and a lot more people now are using that as the future tense. Instead of your normal zaku, they say zoku. And that has actually translated into the books as well. Okay, the next one. Okay, there are more examples there of the ku there. Ukundishia, to leave me behind. Akufunekanga, it is not necessary, the expletive there in I. And then J kutenu ungena kucinga. An example again there of the infinitive. I think the one that I have, okay, never mind that. Okay, can continue. Okay, now that you've seen what the infinitive looks like, and you've seen what the noun classes look like and how they are used by adults, we also want to flip back and look at how children, the process of acquiring these nouns. So I will not go into the phonological development or acquisition of phonology in children, but there are a lot of studies that have looked at the acquisition of vowels. It's not very different from English. However, because we have clicks in some of the Bantu languages, there are some differences there, but they also emerge from the age of 1 to about 1.5 years. So the phonological processes reported in children in Bantu languages are similar to others. So the only one of the main thing is that in Bantu languages, we have very, very few monosyllabic verbs. So usually children, by the time they start talking, they produce bisyllabic. And I guess because our syllable is different from English, instead of CVC, we have CV. So it makes sense that children would start with that. So, and this has actually received a lot of attention in the literature. Although people have employed different methodologies in describing the acquisition of nominal morphology in Bantu languages, there's really a general consensus that the pattern emerges, which follows the 3 overlapping stages, which I've included there. And some of the studies come from Demuth, Connelly, Kunene, Gqilishe, Maphalala, there are lots of them. So there is consensus that children follow the stage where they have the 2 syllables. Now for the languages that have a pre-prefix, such as isiXhosa, we have some kind of a placeholder. And even in Sesotho, where you don't have the pre-prefix, as you can see in the stage 2 there, the V there, there's usually an R or O that children use regardless of what class the noun belongs to. So in children, that develops into another, in Sesotho, that develops into another CV. And then in isiXhosa, then it takes different forms because we have different pre-prefixes in isiXhosa. Next. Okay, so this is an example of an assignment taken from a 3rd-year student. This was way before COVID, where students could still write, and we were marking them. And just to be safe, these ones were not marked by myself. But if you look at you can see the underlining there. Ozo kuka, that's supposed to be oza kukuka. And then noba instead of nokuba, another noba further down. But then when it's the negative, akunyanzelekanga, which is the first line of the 2nd paragraph there, akunyanzelekanga, you can see the ku is inserted there. And then instead of uba, which you would expect because they said noba there, it says ukuba. So you can see even within a very short space, it's almost like there's an unconscious deletion and contraction of the ku. Next slide. Okay, here's another example. This one had a few more. Ignore the first one there. That was just indicating that that's supposed to be 2 words. But if you look in the middle of the paragraph, you can see the example that we gave earlier, nezinto zokudlala. The ku is missing there in the zodlala. Then the sentence below that one, ezidinga ukukhathalelwa, there's supposed to be an uku there. And you can see even the marker missed the u there. The ku on that line, ukukhathalela, it's right below the one marked in red. There are a few other ones further down. but you can see there are instances where the ku is used, and then in other instances, it's not used. Next, please. Okay, these are some examples of this free variation again from social media. You can see I've pulled them out and put them on the left-hand side. But this is a screenshot from, you can see those are from 2017. And I have collected more, and it's more the case now that the ku is omitted even more than it was in 2017. So as you can see, this is someone who wasn't, writing to be marked. So like the previous examples where that's an assignment, this is something that's on social media where people speak freely. So abacoti mna ndifuna ubona instead of ukubona in the first line there. And then the second paragraph, andalila ekseni, there's another ekuseni there, which is an adverb, but the ku is deleted there. Another example of ukubona, and then the third paragraph, uzofika instead of uzakufika, and then a few other ones in the last paragraph, where you can see the first line already, the first word, uzofika, sele kusele, an example there, ukulinda, but then akafuna ukundishia, it says undishia. So you can see this is someone, and it's from Rhodes University. So this is someone who's really paying attention to the way they are writing, but then at the same time, it slips, it goes back to a place where ku is deleted. Next one, please. I'm rounding up now. So looking at the two things that we've been looking at, we're just going to look at one last thing, which is the acquisition of the infinitive by children. I'll take a minute or so on that one. But we need to try and bring this together. So
sorry, Mantoa, you still have plenty of time. You don't need to rush. Still have about 10 minutes at least.
Oh, so good. Oh, good.
Yes.
I can't see the time on the screen. So, okay, thank you.
Yeah, so let's say 10 minutes. I'll let you know, but definitely plenty of time to say anything else you want to say.
Okay, good. So bringing the two together, we need to start thinking now about whether the change happened in the child. So do these children, the way they learn the infinitive as children, does it stay like that and then they become adults who speak like that because this is how they learned it as children? Or is it the adults who are changing the language? Okay, so in that diagram, the input is us, the way we speak as adults to our children, and then do the children fossilize, or do they learn this variation from the parents as part of the input, and then they grow with that input, and then it becomes the new language? So those are some of the questions that we are grappling with. Next one, please. I think an easier way to think about this is that most of the time, the studies that look at the acquisition of language are based on more standardized varieties of language. So we would, for example, take a textbook and say, this is how, in the typical way that I've explained how the negative is formed in isiXhosa, that's based on a textbook. It's not necessarily on how people speak. So we tend to ignore non-standard varieties of spoken language in the linguistic communities of practice. Studies on language variation and change, on the other hand, have also tended to focus on understanding the relationship between variation and change. And in so doing, they focus on understanding why and how change happens over a period of time. So we haven't really made the leap to try and make the link between child language and changes later in life. There are studies recently, however, that have highlighted the importance of understanding the acquisition of language by children and how that might cast some light on processes of variation and language change. So this is based on the premise that children learn grammars from their elders and in turn become elders at a later stage. The grammars that they internalize is learned from input. And if it is learned from input, it should not result in language change. So we shouldn't really be seeing this variation in adults if children learned to omit the input as children. So does this change happen in the child or does it happen in the adult? Next one, please. So someone who has done a lot of work on this is Lightfoot, 2007, but he really started early to try and understand how we can make the connections between change, language variation or language change and language development in children. And he does this by classifying two types of changes. And this he calls the E language and the I language. The E is the external language, is the simple speech that children are exposed to. This form is really unanalyzed. That's what they hear. The I language is the internal one, is the internalized grammar that the child develops. And it depends on what the E language environment is raised in. So much like Chomsky's internal grammar, or if I may put it that way. So the internal language is the kind that the child experiments with. So the kind of sentences and words that the child produces that they've never heard from adults is what we call the I language. So the difference between these two is that the E language is very flexible, which is the external one, and constantly changing. But the I language changes are more systematic. And more importantly, the changes are not made in the I language. That are made to the I language occur during the period of language acquisition, not later on in life. Next. Okay, we can skip this one. There's something I want to highlight quickly. Okay, so these are the patterns that have been attested to in Bantu languages, and these have been documented by quite a number of people. For example, Kunene, 1979, Gowlett and Dowling, 2015, also looked at this. And what is happening here is that in 2A or 2, there's a split there in the plurals. Generally, the plural for noun classes in 11, some were found in 10 and some were found in 6. So for example, if you have a noun like usiba, which is a feather, it's a class 11 noun because it triggers Lu as an agreement marker. But you have two options for the plural. You can say insiba, which is class 10, or you can say amasiba, which is class 6. There are some semantic differences between the two. We also find this in Sesotho as well. Now, in terms of the choice between the two plurals, there's more and more people leaning towards merging the plurals. Instead of selecting from 10, they are now moving most of the plurals to class 6. So instead of having the plural in class 6 and 10, depending on the semantics, whether you want to say insiba or amasiba, more people are saying amasiba. And then the figure in 3 is a completed measure where we get now people even moving class 11 nouns into 5. So for example, usiba, there are people who say usiba is class 5 because they say li in the agreement. This is a study by Dowling and Gowlett. And I've also found this in a lot of my lectures as well, where students more and more stop using the lu as an agreement marker and they use the li. So that's what I call the completed measure. Next one. Okay, now the interesting thing is happening also in children. In children who are learning isiXhosa, for example, instead of having the two plurals where you have ulwimi, you have ilwimi, the choice is amalwimi. Instead of 10, they go for 6. And then where you have ucango, they are even now calling it icango instead of ucango. So automatically the plural becomes amacango. Next one. Okay, we can skip that one. And the next one, I want to go to the struct. Yes, I want to have a look at this one quickly so that I can conclude. The two slides that we skipped, patterns, when you have time, you'll go online and have a look at them, are exactly the same patterns that you see in terms of how children use the infinitive. Initially, they omit the ku in part of their production, but then the second slide, there they start inserting the ku. So it's not the case that they are doing the variation in the same way that the adults are doing. There are some phonological restrictions there that makes it possible, that makes it necessary for them to drop the ku. So now just looking at the three figures, remember we said that the infinitive has two properties. It can either be a noun or it can either be a verb. So as a verb, obviously, it's going to be headed by an IP, which is your structure in B there. And then as a noun, it's going to be headed by a DP, which is a determiner phrase. And in that instance, then it will have a prefix, and then it will have your number, whether singular or plural, and then the stem. And that is broken down, that NP there, when it's the infinitive, it's broken down into the diagram that you see in A there. So instead of having that specifier that has a prefix, the noun has null properties there. And this is what we call pro in controlled instances. Now, null means there's no semantic content there, as opposed to the structure on C, where there's a prefix and there's we're marking number and so on. So basically, the infinitival marker doesn't add any kind of meaning, if I may put it that way. Next one. Finally, it's quite a lot to put in, but hopefully this will start to make sense. Like I've just pointed out, the differences between the structures in the previous slide. A has a null head, and null means it's phonologically null. It doesn't really add any kind of semantic content. The only reason why it's called an NP head is because of its position in a sentence, the syntactic position, and the semantic role that it plays either as a subject or an object. It becomes then it's named and a determiner phrase. So in structure B, you can see that the infinitive is headed by an I, and because of that, it requires a subject. And the subject is pro, and pro takes its properties from, it co-references with either the subject in controlled instances or the object in terms of the object control. For more on that, you can read the thesis by Smose 2010 on the control relations. So bottom line is that the uku there really has no, you can literally do away with it. The sentence will still make sense. Next. So considering the early stages of acquisition, we spoke a little bit about the basic prefixes, and that these are the targets of deletion. And because this information that you find on the pre-prefixes, you can find through agreement. So if I omit the pre-prefix, which happens in other environments as well, you can still know what I'm talking about, because the agreement on the verb, on the following verb, will actually tell you that I'm referring to, for example, something in class 6 and not class 2, for example. So we cannot delete syllables of the stems, of the stem, for example, because the word is going to be meaningless. But we can delete these areas or the parts of the word that do not carry additional meaning. So as you can see in the structure on C, in the later stages of acquisition, there is the deletion of the basic prefix. And this is only limited to class 15 nouns, which is the infinitival form. And this is because unlike other nouns where the noun node, num is for number, the number node is meant to represent whether something is singular. Class 15 does not have a singular or plural form. So it doesn't really matter whether you keep the ku or you delete it, because it doesn't distinguish in number. And because this is unlike other classes, ku does not provide any additional information. So it's always singular. So you really don't need to specify it. I think that's the next final slide. The final thing I want to say, or last two things that have been said about the infinitive, is that it has, the tone is different from the other nouns. And, you know, tone can contribute in various ways, including semantically. And given that the tone is different for the infinitive, this was also noted by Malo looking at Kiswahili in 2013, that the infinitival tone is different from the other, the class 15 tone is different from the other nouns. So it follows from this differentiation of tone then that the inflectional category that has redundant information, that so because it has redundant information, change can happen there. So if we were to simplify a language, that's the place that we would target. And this is also confirmed by Sonderstrom's study of the acquisition of inflection, where we are reminded that the syntax is only useful to the infant to the extent that it conveys the semantic content, even in adult linguistics, by which to judge the syntactic structure structure or analysis assigned by the listener or reader to a particular word or sequence. So putting this simply, we are only using syntax, for example, as children, in as far as it makes us, it adds meaning. So if we are to simplify a system, we will always start with something that makes life a little easier. Next. Okay, so have we answered the question? I'm not going to say this is a change or just variation. But the pieces of evidence of the data that I've shown suggest that it's not necessarily the case that these forms that you see in adult are fossilized, are the fossilized forms from childhood. And besides it being difficult to know whether children grow up using these forms, we really have to follow them from the time they are little until they become adults and see if there's this variation. Or maybe cross-sectional studies of this. But there are instances where full forms are used of the infinitive by children. So it means that they do actually learn the full form of the infinitive. So it's not necessarily the case that they learn the half forms and they grow up with the half forms. So it's not the case that they learn the truncation from the input. So the second part concerns the fact that children with their maturational state of morphological system, they adjust to phonological processes. And these are typical in child language. So they are not making these truncations because of the input. Rather, it's part of the normal process of maturation that you find in childhood. But what is more interesting for our purposes is that this alteration or this phonological adjustment that we observe in children, it's exactly mirroring, it's a mirror of what we see happening in part of variation, so, or language change. So what remains to happen now that we have more data and more written forms, is to start doing a statistical analysis of the deletion of ku in environments where it's supposed to appear, and look at the significance of that. But at the same time, it's worth documenting. So I think that's the end of the presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So we have a little bit of time for, I'm just going to stop sharing this slide so I can see people properly. So we have a little bit of time for questions and discussions. So do I see any? No, I see lots of applause, no hands yet. Let me just check. There was a comment. No, this was just somebody saying that Felix saying he had to leave. So comments or questions? I have lots of comments and questions. So
yes, please go ahead.
So one thing I was wondering about is the role of the augment. So to me, I would have separated these because the augment comes and goes in different ways from the prefixes, right? And yeah. So I was wondering if you want to say more about that, or the pre-prefix, I think you called it.
Well, I use the pre-prefix just to highlight the phonological processes that children go through as part of learning. Remember, what we are trying to look at here is whether the variation or the omission that we see in adults is as a result of what they have learned as children. So what I was showing with the pre-prefix there and how it's often omitted at the beginning, but then later the shift goes to the basic prefix, is to show that children go through morphological processes that has to do with maturation, not necessarily the input. So if it was input, children would not adjust from the zoku and go to the zaku. So if you look at the, I think I should have not skipped the 2 slides where I show how children acquire the infinitive. If you are able to, you can have a look at those. I don't know what number they are, but it's 2 tables. The one is from 2 years to 36 months. You'll see there's an omission of the ku. And then in the second table, you'll see it starts coming in. So that's the only reason why I show that children do these things. They shuffle things around as they develop, as the language matures, but they outgrow that. So it's not the case that they grow up with the contracted form and become adults who speak that way. That's the argument that I'm making. I don't know if it makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I can look at those slides again and then get back to you. Let's give a chance to Annalisa to ask a question, please. And note that you're a student. Hey, we really have students asking questions, so a special welcome and appreciation.
Good.
Hi, thank you. That was very, very interesting. As I was busy typing, I'm not sure how to ask this question. I was wondering, is it that there is, or there seems to be this change or this variation, because now we have so much, I don't know, like we have so much data, like from Facebook and Twitter, seeing how people actually write, how they speak online, versus like many decades ago when we didn't have it. So is it that, you know, people have always been omitting certain parts of uku, or the vowels have always been coalescing and we're just seeing it? I don't know how to phrase that. Maybe an example I can give is, yesterday I was in a tutorial and we were talking about vowel coalescence, and I was writing the same example. I think I gave the example of Ndizakuhamba versus Ndizokuhamba, and some of the students were in a fit saying, you know, no one says Ndizohamba. And I was kind of showing them that, well, you know, in our standard grammars, it's usually Ndizakuhamba, whereas when we do speak, it's usually Ndizokuhamba. So is it that, I don't know, like we now have more examples, seeing that this is how people speak anyway, and they've always done this? Or I don't know if that question is clear enough.
Yes, it is clear. And I think you're asking the same question that I'm trying to answer. Initially, we call it variation because we say this is a spoken variety of isiXhosa, that when you speak, you say Ndizohamba instead of Ndizakuhamba. But then when it starts becoming part of the formalized language, and I mean formalized in a sense that we find final year honors students writing isiXhosa in the informal, if we call it informal, in this form. Is it still variation, or is it now becoming part of the standardized or the standard variety of the language? And yes, you are right. We now have more information because there's Twitter. People are talking. People put things online. But is it still variation, or is this language change in a in progress or in a process? I hope that answers your question.
No, it definitely does. That's very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, we're almost out of time. We can just have a very quick final comment or question from Sarah.
Good morning, Prof. My question is easy, and Prof Mantoa, do you think that this non-standardized variety spoken language, should we take it into language of learning and teaching? If so, why?
I had a student who looked at the reasons why students do badly in isiXhosa in grade 12. And one of the main findings was that because the isiXhosa that is in the question papers and that is in the textbook is very different from the isiXhosa that they are taught in and the isiXhosa that they speak at home. So it's almost like it's a foreign variety. So I think we need to start considering whether we want to teach children in order to understand, or whether we want to teach them, you know, the formal only. I'm not saying we shouldn't, but language change. And if this is how people speak, then that needs to be reflected in the school system as well.
Just a follow-up question to you, Chair.
No, we actually, unfortunately, we have to stop here.